players gathered to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most revered in the history of Magic the Gathering. Force of Will, Knight of the Reliquary, Broker's Charm, and many others. Battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind Bosch and Roll on YouTube, Thraben University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by Moxfield and financial planner Nicholas Robb.
Hello, and welcome to episode 142 of the Eternal Glory podcast, How to Game Legacy. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. As always, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka Thraben U.
I am Brian Coval, aka Bosch and Roll.
And I am Brian Cook of the Epic Storm.
Shout out to all our new Patreon and YouTube members. We've got Lacey W, Corey, and CEDH. The entire format. I feel like I've made that joke before. I think CEDH unsubbed then resubbed. I'm calling you out, CEDH. Where'd you go? Welcome back.
To win in Magic, adjust your strategy as the game changes. The same is true of your investments. Nicholas Robb, financial advisor and certified financial planner, can help you create a game plan for your financial goals. Call 314-968-3783 or email Nicholas Robb at edwardjones.com. That's NICHOLAS.RAUPP at edwardjones.com to get started today. Edward Jones, member SIPC.
If you're interested to advertising to 10,000 plus Eternal gamers every episode, reach out to us. We're always accepting new sponsors.
And that brings us into the episode for today. The three of us all get sent decks from people for our YouTube channels. That's part of what we all offer to the world. And a lot of the times those decks are off meta, or they're trying to do something fun or unusual. And I don't know about you guys, but I have a brew challenge tier to my donation decks where people can just come to me with a concept. And it could be a combo where they just say, I want to see Splinter Twin and Legacy. Or recently on my channel, to amazing success, I might add, somebody came to me and they said, Urogeddon. That's a word that popped into my head and I want you to make it a reality. And okay, I will take your favorite dream and make it into a Legacy deck. And that requires a skill set of understanding how decks need to work in Legacy, because you cannot just put Splinter Twin into a Legacy deck or into the Legacy format, change your Steam Vents into Volcanic Islands and call it a day. There are different rules. And if you're going to be successful, if we want to do a good job for these folks who send us their decks, we have to know how those things work. And this is relevant to the everyday Legacy player as well, because we had some bans. They've been a couple months out, but the format is open in a way that it wasn't for the last year. There is room for new stuff. And if you want to try new stuff or figure out what old stuff works now, these skills will help you do that.
And something to keep in mind is that this is often a process, and a lot of times you're not going to get it right the first time. The three of us are kind of professionals in that, like, we get paid to do what we do. We are financially supporting ourselves by doing this. We have years and years and years of time invested into Legacy. And a lot of times we can get pretty close on the first shot. But almost every time when I record a brew, 15 minutes into the video, I'm like, oh no, I forgot an out to Ensnaring Bridge. Or, oh no, this card could have been better here. You won't always get it right on the first try, but if you understand what you're trying to beat and what are the key things that you're going to see within the metagame, you'll get closer to right more often than not, even if your core idea isn't necessarily the best.
Phil, my 15 minutes in realization is almost always, man, this deck could really use a Surveil land. People do not put them in their decks, and then I'm constantly begging for one mid-match. Like, put Surveil lands in your deck, please.
Same, yeah, that's my bleed. in recent times. Like that's just not in the muscle memory yet, though it should be. So many videos in the past. Man, how long has Murders been out? Has it been a year? Was that the first set of 2024? Has it been that long? 9 months, a year? It's got to be in that general range, right? I see them frantically Googling right now.
February 9th of 24.
Right, so it's close to a year. Yeah, I thought that was the first set last year. Close to a year now, and it's still like, I put in a bunch of work, and we do work hard on these decks. It's not like we just throw it together, take the money, and run. Like, I actually do put real work into this, and I still end up like, that should be a hedge maze. Bummer.
Or worse is when you talk yourself into not running it under like some very valid reasoning, and then match 2, you're like, fuck, I needed a surveil land in this deck. I was wrong. My hubris for thinking I couldn't afford the tapped source in this hyper aggro deck.
Right. Okay, those are some specifics. Let's talk about what people need to know if they are going to build in Legacy. And this applies to all formats. We're going to talk about it in Legacy, but the framework. What is this format about? What are the rules of engagement? Because if you don't know what turn your interaction needs to be relevant on, if you don't know what counterplay your opponents will have, if you don't know what the premier threats are, what the premier answers are in the format that you're going to run into, then you don't have a chance. You got to know that first. So, gentlemen, what is Legacy about? Phil, give us some stuff that Legacy's about.
So, no matter what time period you are in, Legacy is often about tempo. A Delver-style deck has been at the top or close to the top of the metagame for over a decade at this point. You should be expecting to play against Wasteland, Daze, and Force of Will very frequently. The supporting colors, the supporting creatures are probably going to change, but you should expect opponents to be able to answer your spells for free and obliterate your lands.
Right. I've been talking about Delver as true north of the format for as long as I've been doing content. When people come to me and ask what Legacy deck they should start with, or they're building a gauntlet to learn the format, where do I start? It's Delver. Just learn Delver. You have to know those play patterns. You have to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are. If you're going to play decks like that, you have to be really good at knowing when to Wasteland, when to Daze, how to cantrip. And if you're going to play against it, you have to know when you're out of range of Wasteland, when you're out of range of Daze. How do you get yourself out of that bubble? And then their deck is a lot worse if they don't have you down in the dirt.
And one of the hardest things to do is to decide whether or not you are playing around Daze if you know your opponent might have it. And that is something that is built with a lot of experience over time. And sometimes the way you win is like, fuck it, Daze is getting something eventually. I'm going to feed it this spell rather than this better spell another turn down the line.
I am fairly sure in a video within the last week, you can see me go, what? Why is Daze in your deck out of Jeskai control? Like, that is where we're at in Legacy right now. Like, our opponent playing Teferi and Jace the Mind Sculptor was also playing Daze, and I was just completely blown out. So, if they're a blue...
I would never play around Daze from that deck.
Exactly. But they, sure enough, got me. And, you know, Daze isn't in every blue deck, but it theoretically could be.
Right. I will tee up the next rule of engagement. Ancient Tomb, Chalice, Blood Moon. Like, the Ancient Tomb...
Boo!
I mean, I agree. Phil is just doing a victory lap around his office right now while Bryant and I wallow in pain. But yeah, Ancient Tomb as a pillar, your deck has to be able to beat a Chalice of the Void. Your deck has to be able to catch up or slow down somebody who is 2 turns ahead of you. If you're on the draw against an Ancient Tomb deck, they have spent 2 mana already before you get a turn. What is your brew going to do about that? And Blood Moon is frequently part of this package. If it's not Blood Moon, it's Wasteland and Sowing Mycospawn in the Ancient Tomb space. They're going to have some way to mess you up. Does your mana even work? Is another thing that your deck has to clear.
More generally, I think this falls into something that most Legacy decks are trying to do, and that is cheat on mana. Whether it's Daze, Force of Will, Ancient Tomb, Artifact manas, Dark Rituals, most legacy decks are trying to do something fast. So if your plan involves setting up an A plus B combo or gaining synergy over a couple of turns with like some creatures that are lords that are growing each other or something, you have to have something that is slowing down or stopping what your opponent is doing, unless you can just present your own wins so fast that what your opponent doing simply does not matter.
Right. The fundamental engine of Magic the Gathering is Richard Garfield's mana system. The one land a turn, what you're capable of is gated by how much mana you have, different types of mana, different amounts of mana, like both the color spread, like that changes what you or your opponent have access to. That is the whole thing about Magic the Gathering. And generally, when we talk about high power formats, like the standard transition to Pioneer, the Pioneer transition to Modern, then Legacy and Vintage, we're talking about what do you get for one mana, or how hard can you break the mana system entirely. Like Vintage is about Moxen and Black Lotus. Legacy, we get things like Lightning Bolt and Tameo and Delver of Secrets, Dragon's Rage Channeler. I realize I'm listing a bunch of Modern cards, but in Modern, they're not supported by Brainstorm, Daze, Ponder, Force of Will. We get a lot for 0, 1, and 2 mana, where a standard deck might not cast a spell until turn 3, and that's just sort of what they're built on. And that is what we're talking about as we enter higher power formats. We're talking about how much do you get for your mana, and how hard can you break the mana engine.
I think that this is a good time to talk about efficient interaction. So when you think of Legacy, there's Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt, Consign, Swords to Plowshares. But more recently, there's been Modern Horizons 3 pitch cards, Modern Horizons 2 pitch cards, Force of Negation, that cycle was MH1, I believe. But basically, those have left a lasting imprint on Legacy, where if you went back a decade ago, it was pretty much just Force of Will that was like the pitch card that saw play. And now almost every deck has some sort of pitch card they're playing or something close. Like find a green deck that isn't playing Endurance or Force of Vigor, for example. A lot of black decks are on Unmasked now. They were up on Grief before it was banned. Like those are other ways of cheating the mana system. And those Modern Horizons sets pushed a bunch of cards that cheated that mana system that made them almost instantaneously playable in Legacy.
When someone plays a 2 mana piece of interaction, I generally assume that that is a flex slot in their deck. When I see something like an Abrupt Decay, a Sholdred's Edict, a Molten Collapse, I go, okay, that was one of the last cards added to the deck to kind of round out the deck list and maybe answer some specific problem. The default cost of interaction in my mind in Legacy is 1. And if you are playing something that costs more than that, it's because there's something that you are having trouble answering at 1 mana in the colors that you are in.
Yep, or you just maxed out on the 1 already. Like many decks are playing 4 Fatal Push and then 1 or 2 Shoot the Sheriff, Shoulder's Edict kind of cards. They'd play 6 Fatal Push if they could in some situations, and other times, like Phil said, it is solving a specific problem. Recently in a video, I played against the card Exercise, which is like exile an enchantment, kill a creature with power 4 or greater, and it might do something else. It's just 2 mana sorcery from Duskmourn. Bryant's emphatically nodding his head.
Destroys an artifact.
Yeah, you know about it because it's a sorcery for Burning Wish. You just read every sorcery that gets printed, which is part of the topic. I mean, if you're going to be brewing and innovating, I'll let Bryant go off about every sorcery that's ever printed later. But yeah, the card Exercise is something I saw in a deck recently. That's obviously you play that after your 4 Swords to Plowshares. And if Prismatic Ending can't have enough colors to kill Murktide Regent, which it can't in Magic the Gathering, there's only 5 colors. And like that's, you start looking for things like that. I played a lot of Unexpectedly Absent and Council's Judgment in my day when we needed to deal with Counterbalance or True Name Nemesis back in earlier Legacy times. But yeah, that's the specialty slots like Phil said. Your deck, when you build in these formats, when you try to step into this space, you have to understand no creature is safe from 1 mana removal. There's Plow, Push, Bolt. Someone's going to have some way to do it, or 0 mana removal. Just pitch a Fury, pitch a Solitude. that creature could be gone. And you can't invest too much in a creature that's not going to impact the board. Like Baneslayer Angels are not going to make it in Legacy.
But if you are a brewer and you can build a deck that dodges many of the common pieces of removal, you may find that your opponent dies with removal spells that might be valid on other targets in hand. Murktide Regent is a great example here. Murktide Regent is not getting hit by your prismatic endings, your fatal pushes, your lightning bolts, and such. And if you can build your deck in a way that dodges common removal, then one of your threats might get over the finish line, whereas, your Dragon's Rage Channeler or your Delver that is dying to every removal spell under the sun might not.
I had a True Name Nemesis go coast to coast against me this week. I won the match, but game 2, they just stuck a True Name, and I was like, I got nothing here. It's a race. And I did not win the race. I was just dead in 7 hits. But then I sideboarded in some like Pyroblast and things to think about it, and then I was able to answer their 3-drop with a 1-drop, and it wasn't a problem anymore.
Earlier today, I was recording a brew, and I was facing Oops All Spells. I keep a 7 that has Leyline of the Void in it. I'm like, okay, feeling pretty good. They go unmask you, take your 1 card that does something, play my black land untapped, removes 2 Spirit Guides and a Boggart Trawler. And I was like, okay. I died to that Boggart Trawler. My deck did not find another action spell, and I lost the game.
I had a very similar game recently. It was against one of the big Moto grinders. I forget who it was. They were playing Oops, and I'm like, I don't think I can lose with this hand versus Oops. And then I just got hit with a fucking Barrogoyf out of the sideboard, and I'm like, what the fuck? I am so dead. I have 0 outs to that in my deck currently.
Yep, and that speaks to Xantid Swarm or Hope of Girapur if you're nasty. The combo players, after you board out your removal and bring in a bunch of Flusterstorms and Pyroblasts, they just play some creature you can never interact with and then juke on you. But you have to understand the interaction to then sidestep it like that. The next point about Legacy rules of engagement is you are going to be under the gun. Delver of Secrets, Dragon's Rage Channeler, the Eldrazi creatures, something that poops out of an ancient tomb. Almost all decks, or even decks without creatures, the combo decks will be sculpting quickly. We just mentioned Oops All Spells. Like, there is a top 5 deck in the format right now that doesn't intend to give you a turn. You are going to be under the gun one way or another, and you need to either slow that down or be as fast as that. You cannot come into Legacy with some 4-piece combo that takes a total of 11 mana to assemble over 9 turns. You cannot play EDH in this format. You will lose all of your life total before you get to do your thing.
And so finding a way for your deck to be consistent is key. Overlapping combo pieces, tutors, cantrips, cards like Once Upon a Time that can help you smooth out your opening hands. There's a lot of ways to address this other than just, okay, I will remove the creature. Okay, I will Thoughtseize the combo piece. But you have to make your plan work consistently. And a lot of the donation deck lists that I get when they're originally sent to me have a plan that they would like to do. And then my biggest job is, okay, how do we not die to turn 1 Delver of Secrets?
Bryant, would you like to take the last rule of engagement?
It is that combo exists. And I will say this, when you're playing on Magic Online, combo is always more heavily represented. When you're playing in paper, not as much, but when you're playing online, especially these days, be prepared for fast combo.
Yep, and the current metagame is a little more the Dimir Reanimator decks are very different than Storm or Oops All Spells kind of combo. One of the top decks in the format right now is also a combo deck, a graveyard combo deck, and that will skew into paper. But I do agree with what Bryant said. Like the Doomsdays, the Oops All Spells, the Storm players, they are few and far between at FNM, and they are everywhere on Magic Online. But Reanimator is one that you need to be ready for. If your deck right now, operating in the Legacy space, cannot handle Entomb Reanimate, you cannot play that deck. You got to figure something out.
As always, today's episode is brought to you by Moxfield.com. We love Moxfield. So today you're going to hear us talk about a whole bunch of brews in the upcoming sections. If you want to see the deck list that we're talking about, all three of us have our own Mox fields where we have had all of our deck lists for the last couple of years. Check them out on there.
Yeah, and this is a great resource because I post all of my goofy brews from the channel on there. And if you want to kind of cross-check or fact-check what we're talking about in this episode by looking at the deck and being like, these things we just talked about, pull up a random brew, pull up just Rakdos Tarmogoyfs. That's a deck that I played recently, and look at, okay, what is his plan for Wasteland and Days? What is his plan for Ancient Tomb? What's his plan for Swords to Plowshares? How does he beat combo out of the sideboard, if not in the main deck? Go ahead, check against it, and you might learn something. That's all on moxfield.com.
Also, the crazier you are with brewing, the more you become your own best resource. A lot of times when I'm brewing, I will look and say, okay, what did past Phil do when he was playing a black-white aggro deck? It's been 6 months. Let's go check.
Yep, that's all there.
What I love is that I'll search a deck that I want to play, like updated Zubera Storm for Pauper, for example. And then when you look at the Google results, my own Moxfield deck list is the top result. It's like, no, I need to see other people's deck lists.
Yep, been there.
The number of times I have Googled a deck to find either my own past video or like one of Brian's videos as the last person who touched this godforsaken archetype. It's really high.
Yeah, I found that going incognito helps a little bit on Google because like Google caters to you and your browsing habits. And if I search for something, it's going to show me my videos first, which it might not show someone else my video first, but maybe it does. I don't even know. But yeah, going incognito to find someone else's opinion on something has been a useful tool.
All right. With that being said, let's talk about successfully brewing in Legacy.
One of the biggest mistakes that I find when people send me a new idea when it's raw before it's had any professional touch to it is you have to think about what the opposing decks will do as much as you think about what you want your deck to do. If you think about your deck only in terms of, I'm going to cast the following spells, they are all going to resolve, all of the permanents will stay in play throughout the game, and at some point the critical mass will win, your deck has problems. What happens if you're trying to play like some 2-drop engine piece, some 3-drop engine piece, and then on turn 4 you stick the landing, and then your 3-drop gets dazed? What happens to that 2-drop? What happens to that 4-drop? What if your first land gets wasted, and now you can't play your 2-drop till 3? Maybe you don't play your 3-drop at all, and forget about that 4-drop. That sort of thing must be considered, and this is basically another way of saying know the rules of engagement and respect them. That whole first segment we did needs to be applied, because if you aren't thinking about these things, you will lose to them.
So it's often really useful to look at an established deck to understand how it is engaging with the format. So, for example, one of our little bullet points in this section is that you can't play cards that cost 4 or more mana unless you have a plan for days. Well, Moonstompy plays a bunch of cards that cost 4 or more mana, oftentimes running 8 of them, sometimes even 12 of them. Well, how can they get away with it? Ancient Tomb and Spirit Guides and Chrome Mox boost your mana count to make it so that those are more castable. And if every card you're playing is a game-ending haymaker, and you just keep punching your opponent in the face again and again and again, eventually, one of your things is probably going to resolve. So if you play a Chalice, and then a Blood Moon, and then the One Ring, what are the chances your opponent gets to answer all 3 of those in quick succession if you do that turn 1, turn 2, turn 3? And there is a clear plan.
Right, and that's critical redundancy in deck building. It's kind of burn versus storm kind of deck building, where Storm wants to resolve 10 spells in a turn, and there are probably 1 or 2 stress points that if you have the correct interaction, you can break their chain. Burn wants to resolve 7 spells over the course of the game, and it doesn't matter which ones they are. And you can go the way of Red Stompy, like Phil was describing, just play 12 4-drops and you can't daze them all, sucker, here they come. That's like, my deck is just 40 lightning bolts, you can't counter them all. Your life total's going down whether you like it or not. Or you can build an engine that protects itself. Like, we have a storm expert here on the call who can tell us that there are critical spots in the chain where if your fourth spell of the turn, like if you like LED ritual beseech, and then beseech gets countered, you're down 4 cards. Like, you can't actually just absorb that turn after turn the way Red Stompy does. So, Brian, what are you doing in a deck like that to get around a card like Daze or Force of Will?
Well, earlier we talked about free interaction. Storm Combo typically doesn't get to play free interaction, but what it does get to do is play interaction that costs 1. So we mentioned Thoughtseize. That is often a card that sees play. There's also things like Veil of Summer, Orm's Chant, Duress, things like that, where you're looking to punch a hole through and then execute your own game plan. As someone who builds a lot of combo decks, but also receives a lot of combo brews, Phil mentioned redundancy. And I think that's so, perfect for this segment, because what I find is a lot of people will be like, hey, I have this sick idea, and they'll share their idea. And I'm like, okay, well, there's only 4 of that. What else are you going to do if you don't find it? And they're like, oh, well, we could have like 4 Ponder. Okay. But like, how many games are you actually finding this 4 of, or whatever? There has to be consistency. So if you're not going to play something that's super redundant, you almost have to play the Xerox or blue cantrip shell, so that way you have a higher opportunity to find your combo piece. I think that Legacy Doomsday is a perfect example of this. They do have Personal Tutor, but they also have Brainstorm, Consider, Preordain, Ponder, and then cycling cards like Street Wraith and Edge of Autumn. Like, they are so likely to find their one key spell, where it makes up for the fact that they are playing a deck with only 4 cards that they're trying to find.
Right, and Doomsday, compared to traditional Storm Combo, gets forces and dazes of its own, so it can buy time. It would prefer to use Force of Will to protect its game-winning spell, but if it has to keep a One Ring or Trinisphere or whatever off the stack, it can do that too. So, like, Doomsday, it was described to me by Maxtortion once as a mono blue deck splashing BBB for its game-ending card, and that really helped me understand that deck better, and that is how Doomsday chose to build, compared to something like the Epic Storm, which plays like Veil of Summers or Orm's Chance kind of cards, or Thoughtseize, depending on the metagame it moves, or some combination of all those things.
And if you look at Doomsday, we were talking about, what is your answer to Ancient Tomb, Chalice of the Void, Blood Moon? Doomsday's answer is they're never going to resolve. They play 8 forces between the main deck and the sideboard. Rather than spend time, tempo, resources, whatever, on answering a resolved Blood Moon, they just go, no, you don't get to do that. They counterspell it and move on with their lives. And that seems to be working for that community.
Another thing I think you have to be really conscious of in deck building is Wastelands and Blood Moons. Legacy historically has pretty much always been a Wasteland format. And there are certain times where the metagame is more hostile towards non-basic lands than others. So to use a historical example, when Wrenn and 6 was legal and you could just keep picking up Wasteland again and again and again and again, it was really tough to be on non-basic lands. And in current Legacy, we're in another really hostile period to non-basic lands, because you have Sowing Mycospawn out of Eldrazi that can tutor up Wasteland at will. You have Blood Moons and Magus of the Moons oftentimes out of Moonstompy decks. You have Harbinger of the Seas being an incredibly common blue sideboard card these days. You need to have a plan for your mana, and if you are dead to one or more of these cards, you need to figure out how you are going to be answering them.
Yep, and a big thing that I have been a proponent of, it is one of the slogans of my channel, Island Ponder Keep. Basic lands. That's something that decks are allowed to contain. I just released a modern deck this week. I mean, modern's got slightly different rules because there's no Wasteland, but there's still Blood Moon and Harbinger. Somebody had splashed Psychic Frog into Jeskai Energy control, and the mana base had a single basic plains among its 23 lands, and everything was a Triome Shockland or came into play tapped because it was a Surveil land, and I just found myself getting roasted to death. I'm like at 13 by the time I cast my first spell of the game, even if my opponent hasn't hit me. And that's its own kind of problem. And then if you go into a higher power format where you get more powerful effects for cheaper, where Wasteland, which is normally would cost 3 mana in Modern, costs 0 mana in Legacy. That is something that you have to be ready for. And if you're building this house of cards, this pillow fort based on Xander's Lounge into Savannah, how bad is it for you if they waste your Savannah or your Xander's Lounge? Does your entire strategy collapse, or do you play enough lands? Can you get the right land types? Or maybe should you not be doing this at all? And how do we build a deck with more basic lands in it?
And your sideboard might be really, really dictated by how bad you are against Blood Moon and Harbinger of the Seas and Wasteland. So, for example, let's say you are really cold to Magus of the Moon in particular. Maybe your deck doesn't have the basics to support consistently finding basic planes plus Swords to Plowshares or something. Maybe you need to default to Dismember that can just always be cast to kill that or Harbinger of the Seas. And you might find, if you lose to something else under similar logic, such as Collector Oof, you might need to spend a couple of sideboard slots addressing a major problem like this.
Yeah, I have a practical example of that. 2 Eternal Weekends ago, December 2023, Pokemoki and I were working on Bug Beanstalk that we both played at the event, and we were really worried. Boros Initiative was a deck in the format at the time. White Bloom had been banned, but the deck was still out there, and they were playing Magus of the Moon, and we were pretty soft to Blood Moon. And it was kind of an 11th hour, like less than a week before Eternal Weekend. One of us was like, what about Dismember in the sideboard? And that just completely flipped the matchup. I think I played against Red Stompy 5 times at Eternal Weekend, and I beat it 4, which I would have beat it 0 or 1 without the Dismember. It really was that big just having that one tool because we understood what the format was about.
And the final pillar would be combo exists. So is your plan Force of Will, Sphere Resistance? Are you a Green Sun Zenith deck for Collector Roof? Do you have crop rotation into Wasteland? Is Leyline of the Void in your sideboard? Are you playing Mindbreak Trap, Fairy Macabre, Surgical Extraction, these sort of things? So I do have an opinion that Brian and Phil might not agree with here. And if you're trying to brew a deck in Legacy, it is incredibly tough to come up with something new and unique that beats all of these things. There's very few decks in Legacy that are good against all of these things. My suggestion is pick the one that is least likely and hope to dodge or punt or overboard in your sideboard for that matchup. For example, if you're on lands, you're more than likely not going to be good against combo, but you're probably going to be pretty good against everything that isn't the Blood Moon deck. So that means that your sideboard can be dedicated for beating combo and Blood Moon. And then you ask yourself, what are the elements of these matchups that overlap? And you might think, oh, Force of Vigor is very good against both. Maybe I should be playing an extra Force of Vigor today. Or perhaps maybe you want to add in an extra Beseiju and prioritize an extra basic forest in your main deck so that way you can channel the Beseiju more often. These are the sort of level ups you can make so that way you get a little bit more out of your sideboard slots than you normally would. Something that I've been doing personally with the Epic Swarm recently is with Leyline of the Void becoming more popular, we've been looking for more ways to use our sideboard cards, so we started sideboarding in the Empty the Warrens, which I've never done before. But by doing this, you can use the sideboard copy of Beseech the Mirror to grab the main deck copy of Empty, so if you're on the play and you have a turn 1 hand where you can go Gaia's Will or Song of Creation, now you have Empty the Warren, so you don't have to pick and choose, do I lose to Endurance or do I lose to Force of Vigor? You could just put 12 goblins onto the table. And that was never an option before. So getting more out of the cards that you're using can go a long way, and that's what I'm trying to describe here.
So I want to follow up on Empty the Warrens. I had seen a post somewhat recently. It was just some random YouTube comment, something along the lines of like, oh, you shouldn't play around Empty the Warrens. That card is dead. No one plays it anymore because Tamiyo exists, and a Tamiyo Plus just, undoes Empty the Warrens. And here you are talking about a use case for Empty the Warrens that is really, really valid. So keep in mind that things are going to wax and wane in terms of when they are good, when they are bad. Try not to lock yourself into mindsets because I think constant adaptation is what allows a lot of the brewers and the deck specialists to succeed.
Yeah, definitely keep an open mind. Be willing to try something even if you don't think it's good. Sometimes I'll have, pretty strong opinions about something, but I'll begrudgingly try it, and then it ends up exceeding my expectations. And, that's good because that means that, it might be applicable in another deck I'm working on.
And while we're talking about combo and what you can do out of your sideboard to fight combo, I want to urge some caution. Sideboarding, both building and using a sideboard, I believe is one of the hardest and least studied, least practiced skills that a Magic player can have. And some of the brews that come my way, they just have like 4 Leyline, 4 Mindbreak Trap in the sideboard or something. And they're just sort of hand waving, well, now we've got combo covered. And maybe like it's a Thalia deck or a Sphere of Resistance deck or something where my Mindbreak Trap's not actually free, like that sort of thing. Or I get decks that have like 4 Leyline of the Void and then also 4 Surgical Extraction. And Surgical Extraction is useless if you start with a Leyline in your hand. And what 8 cards are we boarding out for these 2 things? There's just this, you need to understand how many slots you actually have and how these pieces are going to interact with each other if you have multiple things in. Like an Ancient Tomb deck that plays Thorn of Amethyst and Mindbreak Trap in the sideboard. If you are on the play and resolve your Thorn of Amethyst, you're not going to need that Mindbreak Trap. And if you successfully Mindbreak Trap, then later top deck Thorn of Amethyst, that's pretty awkward too. Like that's just something that needs to be considered carefully rather than just maxing out the most of it. And making sure your deck still works after you board in your 8 to 12 hammers for combo. Like, what deck could cut 8 cards out of it, much less 12, and still function as a Magic deck? That's a lot of your deck that's now not in your deck anymore. All of these things are things that need to be balanced.
Something that I've learned as a Burning Wish gamer over the years, and really, I think 2020 is when I started applying this thought process or thought method, is your sideboard, 100% of your sideboard. So each card is worth roughly 6.67, we'll round up to 7%. So every card in your sideboard is 7% of the total. I try to get the most out of all of my sideboard slots since a bunch of them are wish targets. So I'll ask myself, if I'm going to spend 7% of my sideboard on this card, what is it, the percentage against the field? So if I'm boarding in this Mindbreak, is it at least hitting 7% of the field? And if I add in a second copy, is there 14% of decks where I feel like I can board this card in against? I use that philosophy even when I'm not building Burning Wish sideboards at this point. And it's a rough estimate. It's not always perfect. But that way you'll be like, okay, maybe I don't need 3 Mindbreak Trap, or maybe I don't need the 4th Force of Vigor or 4th Endurance. Like, whatever you're building, I'm just trying to provide examples here. But it helps you balance your sideboard a little bit more. And then you'll be like, oh, well, actually, I don't necessarily need this. Maybe I can add in this other card for a matchup that might be bad. Or maybe you can even add in a card for the most popular deck in the format. And you might already have a decent matchup, but if you have that spare slot, you can make it even slightly better. I know that a lot of people think sideboards are only for fixing problems. They can also be for pushing advantages against popular strategies.
Yeah, one of the biggest sideboard level ups for me is I was working on a vintage deck with the Dr. Richard Shea, the Atog Lord, who had been a very successful deck builder for years, and I was just starting to kind of understand Eternal formats and get into my competitive bend. And I just laid out my deck and I was like, I need help building a sideboard here. And he looked at it for 1 second and he was like, okay, we need at least 5 cards for Shops. And it wasn't because Shops was present in the metagame or that my deck was weak to Shops. It's because my main deck had 2 Flusterstorms, 2 Pyroblasts, and a Mental Misstep in it, all of which have no targets against the Mishra's Workshop strategy. You could hope to Mental Misstep their Soul Ring or Mana Vault, I guess, but Pyroblast, Flusterstorm, Stone Blanks. And Dr. Shea immediately understood, just by looking at this, that our sideboard map, we would need to improve a matchup. Maybe the matchup's already good. Like I'm a Force of Will deck with a clock. If I'm on the play, I could just dumpster them with my Moxen. Maybe I'm not even worried about Mishra's Workshop as a pillar. Just seeing, yeah, these 5 cards got to be out. You have to improve your deck after sideboard. Doesn't just mean bring good cards in. It could mean take bad cards out too. And that's because Rich really understood the rules of engagement in that situation.
I find that there's often categories of cards that you will board out all of them. So for example, you might be playing against a combo matchup where all your spot removal is going to be bad. You might be playing in a matchup that you expect is going to go very long, so you don't want your discard to be a bad top deck in the late game. So a really easy way to identify like how many generic cards do I need versus X type of matchup is like look for those pockets of cards. Like, oh, these are my really slow cards. I don't want those versus combo. I don't want, discard or spot removal or even sometimes lock pieces. There's sometimes where I might want to board out 4 to 8 lock pieces if I'm playing a pseudo mirror, trying to find those pockets and go, okay, if I need to board all of those out, are there things that I could board in? Even if they're not optimal things, can we at least get to better things?
Another level up that I had was finding cards that overlap varying matchups. So I mentioned Ancient Tomb and combo with like Force of Vigor, but you don't always need a hammer. Sometimes you need glue. And the glue cards might actually get you further. And I think a perfect example of a glue card in Legacy is Brazen Borrower. It does a little bit of everything. Yeah, it temporarily bounces something. It can be your threat. And it's never amazing. It's never like the best card in your deck. But the fact that it does so much means that it can be a 2 of in your main deck or a 1 of, and it can sometimes save you a sideboard slot. And I think that those cards don't get enough recognition because everybody's trying to play the next Meltdown or Null Rod or whatever it is that completely shuts off a deck, when sometimes your deck might need, that glue card because like Brian was saying, you have 5 cards to take out. But if you switch that 5th card to a card like Brazen Borrower, maybe it's only 4, and that opens up a sideboard slot for another matchup.
Right. And a card like Brazen Borrower, you'll never end up in a spot like Phil started with at the top of the episode of, oh crap, I forgot an answer to Ensnaring Bridge. Brazen Borrower is just one of those things that I am happy to just make that my 59th or 60th card in almost any deck that could cast it. I think the poster child of what you're describing here, Bryant, though, is Endurance. Like it's kind of Force of Will versus Graveyard combo decks. It is also a tempo play if you can Endurance someone's graveyard the turn that you think they're going to play Murktide Regent. It also just blocks Thalia or Goblin Rabblemaster or whatever the hell they have. It is a big creature at a fair rate, stuffs graveyard combo. The way that it specifically stuffs graveyard combo also works against Endurance, or it works against Doomsday. Like Endurance just plugs so many holes, and I'm so happy to just put 1 or 2 of those in a 75 and know that I'm going to get a lot of mileage out of it.
It makes a lot of sense to me.
I mean, I often put 3 or 4 Endurances into sideboards of like lands style decks or anything in that Maverick style ballpark, because it really gives you the ability to insert more threats versus control while also just addressing tempo and graveyard combo issues. That card has been awesome glue for me.
Yeah, and just having Flash, even like taking the initiative or the Monarch from an opponent out of nowhere. This initiative or Endurance is just a well-rounded jack of all trades, incredible magic card at just plugging a hole. And it checks a lot of the same boxes Brazen Borrower does, and finding a card like that will help you a lot in deck building.
If you are looking for some generic colorless glue for your decks, like you just need something generic that you can board in to stop stuff and you don't know what that card should be, I think Disruptor Flute is a really good generic card that you can be playing in sideboards, especially if you have any fast mana at all. It can stop or hinder something like Nadu combo. It can stop decks that are centralized around one specific card like Show and Tell or Doomsday. It can Pithing Needle Wastelands if that's important. Disruptor Flute is a great, I don't know what my last sideboard slot should be card.
Gentlemen, let's say that you've been working on your brew and you've been working on it for a few months, but you're not sure how exactly to improve upon this. Like you've been playing it in leagues, you know where the holes are, but you're not exactly sure what you should do. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I love keeping data on myself. I use it like fantasy baseball, where I'll track 50 to 100 matches with the list, so that way I can see where my weaknesses are, and I'll take notes. I'm like, hey, Pulverize won this match, and I'll take little notes on everything, and then I'll go back and check the notes and use what the data says, like, hey, I'm now winning 72% against blue decks, but my mid-range dipped. What can I do to fix that? And sometimes there is no answer, but sometimes you'll be able to swap a card, then raise that percentage up a little bit. So I really am a fan of keeping data. And I know that, Magic, somebody left this on a video and it sticks in my head now. Like, Magic isn't played in spreadsheets, but tell that to professional baseball players and the sabermetrics people that have, created livings and revolutionized the sport. There's no reason that couldn't be Magic the Gathering. And I think there's a lot of equity being left on the table because people are afraid of spreadsheets and numbers.
Yeah, and there's simple versions of that too. Like Bryant goes all the way in on all those various metrics. Something that I tell my coaching clients all the time when they're just like, oh, I can't decide whether I should play this card or this card. Just make a T chart. Draw a vertical line and then cut it in half with a horizontal line on a piece of paper and write good on one side and bad on the other. And then just tally every time you draw the card. Or if it's like between Brazen Borrower or Snapcaster Mage, put Brazen Borrower one column, Snapcaster Mage the other. And every time you draw either card, put a tally, mark which one would have been better if it was the one that you had. And over time, the vibes go away because we tend to remember good things better than bad things. Like we quickly dismiss bad things as like, oh, that was variance, that was bad beats. If I had one more turn, whatever. But you remember the time that you get to do the big crazy thing. But if you have that tally mark in front of you after 20 matches or 10 leagues or whatever it is, and one side is just clearly bigger than the other, just go with it. And that's like the simplest form of what Brian's describing. And then you can go all the way up to just data on data, interacting, whatever, and knowing everything about everything.
Brian, what you described drives me nuts because I'll be answering questions in the Storm Discord or somewhere else, and they're like, oh, I don't want to cut that card. It was nuts for me one time. I'm like, well, I'm glad that one time you got to do the thing, and I'm sure it was really awesome. But how often is that one time realistic? Like once every 100 matches? Is that really worth a sideboard slot?
Right. I'm going to take a small side tangent on that just to acknowledge that we have assumed throughout this episode that your goal is to win the most matches of Magic with the deck you're building. There are folks, and I think this is a fine way to engage with the game, it's just not what we're talking about, for whom doing the thing is all that matters. If they show up to an SCG Con Legacy 5K and play 7 or 8 rounds of Legacy, and they get to pop off once, and they go 1-6, and they're like, yeah, I did it. And they get to high five their friends, and then they go out to dinner, and they're happy with that experience. That's fine. If that's you, go off. And I do frequently have people, when they submit these decks, which is kind of the frame for the whole episode, where they're just like, I just want to see an Ugin hardcast once in Legacy. Like that, if that happens once, I'll be really happy. And then I do my best to make the deck work in Legacy and try to get them their hardcast Ugin. You could also just not work on your deck at all and play enough that it would eventually happen. But we're trying to find the medium here where even if you are that person who just wants to see your thing happen, let's do it well. And if you're in the off-meta brew space and you're not winning and you want to win more, maybe consider one of the established decks that you don't need to brew at all. But all of these things are fine. I just think that's important framework to acknowledge what your goals are with your deck. Something that we did not start at the top of this episode with. We just assumed the goal is to win.
Looping back to like playtesting and gathering data and such, for those of you who are playing paper Magic, do not be afraid to cheat in your testing to figure out how good things are. One thing I did a lot when I was trying to test specific matchups back when I was playing Death and Taxes is I would say, okay, we're going to play 10 post-board games. Every game on turn 3, artificially, my draw is going to be this sideboard card. I want to test and see how this plays out if I am drawing this card when I want to play it. What percentage of those games am I winning? How does that feel on both sides of the table? And setting up situations like that might speed along your analysis of these cards.
Right. And you can do things like, I'm going to start the next 5 games with Aether Vial in my opening hand. And the 5 games after that, I'm going to cut Aether Vial from my deck and just see the range of how this deck works when I'm doing exactly what I want, which is a turn 1 Aether Vial, versus when I have to play Magic normal. Does the deck still function? Just something like that. Or in a testing game where you walk into a trick or something, like you get your essential spell Dazed, and you're just like, okay, fine, you win. Let's back this up. Let me play through this turn and see if I can beat Daze. Like, that's also something to do. If you're air quotes testing with your friends and you're just taking turns beating each other and not talking about the games or breaking it down or anything, I'm a big fan of just putting my hand face up and being like, what do you think I should do here in a testing game? And your opponent, with the information they have, is like they can either hide their info and be like, well, if I have Daze, you should do this. If I have Force, you can't win anyway, so you shouldn't play around it. And just that back and forth is really useful. And you could take those deck building notes while you're doing it.
All right, let's move into our final section here. Let's talk about some of our own recent successes in brewing. What are you enjoying playing in Legacy? What has worked for you that you've brewed with recently? Brian, why don't we start with you?
I've been messing around with various Bant control shells again, and that's just Magic that I like to play. And sowing Mycospawn is a huge problem for decks like that. However, not every deck you play against is going to be Eldrazi. And against Eldrazi decks, you just sideboard 3 or 4 consigned memories and hope they line up right. The Bant control decks, where you get basic lands, you get Life from the Loam, Uro. Like, Uro pulls you ahead of Wasteland and Daze. It cushions your life total versus that pressure we talked about. You're a Force of Will deck with powerful sideboard options like Null Rod or Deafening Silence for the combo decks. You're just like checking a bunch of boxes. Calling Bant control a brew is a little loose because obviously that has been a top meta deck in the past, but control has not been viable for a year now. And I still don't know that I would recommend it, playing it into a Sowing Mycospawn field if you're playing the Legacy Pro Tour, if you're at Eternal Weekend and you only get 1 loss on the day. I still don't know that I could recommend it. But I have had a lot of fun exploring that space again and checking all of those boxes that we talked about. All those pillars are represented here. And I'm either using them myself or I'm prepared to play against them.
Bryant, have you been working on anything other than just Storm, or are you fully in the tank with Storm right now?
So, like the both of you, I received pretty interesting donation decks, and I'd like to talk about 2 videos back to back that I thought were pretty insightful. So, reading the Storm Discord, when the bannings happened, a bunch of people were like, Black Saga Storm's back! Because when you looked at the Saga Storm decks, they were trying to go green for Veil of Summer, and then they couldn't play Vault of Whispers anymore, which affected their Mox Opals. So going mono black again was really important to these people. They're like, I want to play Orcish Bowmasters again. I think that Saga's very good. So I recorded that deck, and it went live on Monday if you're interested in checking that out. And at the end of the video, I came to a couple realizations. One, and this is going to upset podcast listeners because a bunch of you don't like it when we say this, Orcish Bowmasters felt terrible. It did not seem like a very good card in my league. The second thing is that Urza Saga felt so underwhelming because it didn't have a Vexing Bauble to go grab, and the constructs were consistently outclassed. Like, that was one thing I found. It's like, do I really want to spend 2 turns making constructs? Because every time that I do, they ended up being outclassed very quickly. And I was like, man, Urza Saga feels bad without Vexing Bauble. So if Bowmasters is bad and Saga didn't feel as good as it used to, why would I play this deck? And then my next deck I actually queued into Brian with for match number 5, which was Mono Black Belcher, which is essentially built out of the same shell as Black Saga Storm, except you get to cut all of the lands for MDFCs. And when you do that, your Mox Opal deck now that plays 20 artifacts now has enough black cards to support Unmask. And that was something. And I think that there's something truly there, but the deck list that I was given had 10 discard spells, which didn't play super well with Echo of Aeons. So I think that maybe instead of running, discard spells 7 through 10, you can maybe play Defense Grid. So use Unmask to punch a hole to resolve your Defense Grid and then Unmask. Because playing 12 MDFCs with Unmask did feel unfair in a lot of matchups where I was like, I shouldn't be allowed to do this. It was way too good. So I think there's something there, but people need to work on it. And then when I'm working on the Epic Storm, I've just been running so hot. Over the course of 56 matches right now, I'm at 75%. I played my first Legacy Challenge in almost a year last week, and I came in 11th on tiebreakers. So, I mean, I've been doing really well, and I think the big thing there is that my prison win percentage has gone up because the fact that Vexing Bopple's banned, it unlocked Pulverize, and I've been using that to bully people that mulligan to Chalice of the Void.
Heck yeah. And that's a great example of using all of the tools that we've talked about for the last hour in terms of brews for just updating a deck that you know extremely well. That's something you could do too. All the same rules and tools apply to making slight tweaks to something you know well versus building something out of the air. Phil, you're always goofing around. Tell us about one of the things you've been doing lately.
I have been having a lot of fun brewing with graveyard strategies, like fair graveyard strategies. I really like the Nethergoyf, Borrowgoyf sorts of cards, fear of missing out, these sorts of things that get some degree of value from the graveyard. I recently 5-0'd with essentially an 8-cycler Rakdos Reanimator aggro deck with Troll of Khazad-dûms and Oliphants. I talked about it a little bit in the pre-show, so I'm not going to reiterate here. But the thing that I want to bring up is that if you want to be successful, I think understanding the rules of engagement is really important. And I actually pulled up Brian's recent Rakdos deck list that he talked about in the pre-show as well, his Rakdos Amped Raptor deck list. And our sideboards are very similar. 4 Leyline of the Voids, 2 versus 3 Meltdowns, 2 copies of Feed the Swarm specifically in both of our sideboards. Feed the Swarm, in case you're not familiar with that one, is 1 colorless and a black. Destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls, you lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. And that is some great glue. That is a card that you can bring in a ton of matchups. Maybe it's hitting an opposing Leyline of the Void. Maybe it is hitting a Leyline Binding. Maybe it's just killing a Murktide Regent that you otherwise might have trouble answering. But like when I pulled up these deck lists and I saw how similar they were, it was just like, okay, we were both brewing Rakdos. Our heads were in the same place about what is important to answer with these sideboard slots. And I felt like that was kind of a good note to end on here.
Yeah, that's great. And talking about glue in these like goofball Rakdos decks, there are 4 Molten Collapses across the 75 in Rakdos Amped Raptor. Get it dead. Whatever it is, it's dead. And sometimes 2 things are dead. You worried about Chalice of the Void? It's dead. Murktide Regent? It's dead. And sometimes you just get something for free along the side. I believe I Molten Collapsed a few Storm players quite effectively. Just like clip a random, Lotus Petal or LED that is sitting around in addition to their Bowmaster or their Juke Creature or whatever it is they're doing. Their Hull Breacher, whatever. A card like Molten Collapse just does it.
Phil, Feed the Swarm is a card that a lot of Legacy Storm players love because a bunch of those people have moved to mono black. So Feed the Swarm answers Deafening Silence or Leyline, which is pretty huge. But the big question is, if you're mono black, how do you deal with Chalice of the Void? So a lot of them try things like Surge Node in order to level up the Chalice increments. So you can get up to like a number like 3 where it doesn't matter, and then you can win the game, which can be found off of an Urza Saga, by the way. Or when I played the Mono Black Belcher video, I was like, if Feed the Swarm is covering those things, what about something like Ratchet Bomb for Chalice of the Void? It never ended up coming up in my video, but I thought that was an interesting space too.
And I think that's one of those things that you figure out with time, is you lose to something and then you go, okay, what can I do to have outs to that next time? You don't need to necessarily try to beat it every single time, but you would like to have at least an out to something that you can cantrip towards or tutor towards or cycle towards.
And the enlightenment level skill here is if you've lost to enough things enough time over a long enough career, you'll think about it the first time and your decks just get better. And that's the process.